Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Danger on Delmarva. My name is Rhonda Jefferson, and I'll be your host as we explore the dark and winding roads that lead around the Delmarva Peninsula. If you're unfamiliar with the peninsula, we are an area in the mid Atlantic region of the United States that includes all of Delaware, or most of it, depending on who you ask, Maryland to the east of the Chesapeake Bay Bridge, and Virginia to the northeast of the Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel. Today, we'll be looking at a story that, frankly, seems to me went under the radar. I was actually looking for information on another event. It wasn't even anything for the podcast. It was just, I had a notification pop up on my phone about a news story, and it included, at least from that part I'd read to that point, information about a young person being shot, so a child being shot. And I think most anybody seeing that would want to know how that happened. So I did a couple of searches and not really seeing, the whole title before, just out of habit, I always just scroll through everything. And so I did a broader search and this story came up. And so I kind of redirected, doing an episode on this first. I was going to be doing an episode on the Linda Charbonneau case, which is a case I'm extremely familiar with. I was on Oxygen's Buried in the Backyard for that episode. So I wanted to maybe go in a little more in depth, even just knowing about the facts of the case. But again, this kind of made me redirect things because in that week, in the same town, there was another child that drowned, even just literally less than 3/4 of a mile from my home. And I did, a Google Map search to get the exact distance. And you can ride it or by a bike or drive it in less than 3 minutes. So a lot of the area, it's still residential. So the speed limit is 15 miles an hour through most of the drive. And a little girl was shot in a different, or her car was shot at a different location, but they ended up at the apartments with a couple of vehicles damaged by gunfire. So looking at the story that we'll be going over today, again, it just kind of feels like it went under the radar and I hadn't even heard about it. The first article I read regarding the story was extremely slanted. And I think all of us, when we read news, especially when it involves children, there's a very big emotional kind of slant that, we feel about the story. And this article was definitely slanted, of course, to the favor of the child. I also feel in a lot of ways that it was also because of what was left pretty much unsaid or not followed up on that led towards some of those feelings as well. So I know a lot of times I say I'm going to try to be as impartial as possible when going through the story, but I usually make one or two quips that really shows how I feel. But because of just how hard it hit, really, reading that first article, I think this is the strongest case of being, I need to be impartial while reviewing it, just so the other aspects of the case don't get lost while only focusing on one thing. So before getting into too much detail on the story, I do just want to go over some of the things I normally go over near the beginning of each episode, as well as just some updates. Now, first, the summer is coming to an end, and my younger son started school today, and my older son will start school tomorrow. They'll both be at the same school now. And it was the first time that the school has implemented clear backpacks as well as purchasing new equipment so they can more quickly, scan kids as they come in, metal detectors, because of the incident last year where a student brought a gun and a knife to school. I had since heard things about he was being bullied, but also at the same time, there were hundreds of innocent children in the school. And even, his bullies, we don't know what was going on there, if it had been reported to the school, if the school had seen it themselves, or what the exact situation was. But, there were just hundreds, if not thousands, of students in the school, as well as an elementary school, a middle school, and a preschool, all within very close proximity. And by very close, one of them was actually on the same property, and another would have been maybe 100 yards from the high school. So, if that was the case and he was bullied, I was bullied as well in school. Like, someone replaced a chair one time with a broken chair when I was out of the room. And when I came back in and sat down, I fell. And that was based on, attributes such as my weight. I know that now there's the cyberbullying where you don't even need to be present to be bullying someone and saying some very hurtful things. But again, it doesn't get past the fact that there were so many children, in the area that had absolutely nothing to do with what had occurred. So that's a little nerve wracking. Like, I didn't send my children to school the day after that happened, but, I have complete faith in the actual, police, the school resource officer. The police station is actually just across the street. I've always said that if there was an emergency, it probably would be quicker for the officers, if they were, whoever was in the building, to actually run from the building to the school rather than trying to get into their cars unless they had equipment they needed. That's how close it is. So those are some comforts, but again, it's knowing that we're living in a day and age where that's happening in schools and has been for, a few decades now, that it's been prevalent in schools. It's just hitting very, very close to home, because a lot of cities or towns on Delmarva are still very small, and, it feels more safe, I think, even as times are changing. Population is increasing, so we're all living kind of closer together. And, just there's more danger, it seems, than when I was growing up. But at the same time, there wasn't instantaneous access to news at those times. And speaking of my younger son, if you've listened to previous episodes, you've probably, you heard me talk about my father, and he had passed away. It did take a little while to, gather funds for the funeral, but we did. And the same week as my dad's funeral, it was also my son's birthday, and his girlfriend's birthday was the day before his. So her family took them to the beach just so, he could get out of the house, kind of relax, be a teenager in the summer. And he actually injured his feet and was in a wheelchair like pretty consistently for the next week. And then over the next couple weeks, he was able to get back more to normal, but we had to go to the doctor every other day. I found out his pediatrician is actually open on Saturdays, even though he's pretty close to being outside, of a pediatrician. He's a teenager, but still, that's good to know. But he had to go in every other day to have the wounds cleaned and things like that. But he is back to normal. It was just, something else on top of, everything going on, which then delayed us being able to clean out my father's home. But, again, I'm hoping that we can get back to normal, as close to normal as we can, because it still seems like everything we pick up or look at reminds us in some ways of my father. But we are a pretty close-knit family, so we're all there for each other. Now, as you can tell from my introduction, today's story will involve a minor, and actually it will include two. And the second one is in that aspect of what's not really addressed too much during most of the articles. So, at the end, I'll go back and address that. But two minors will be involved, and there will be one that does die. So I just wanted to put that out there so everybody knows that this is, pretty sensitive topic and hard to hear about with, such a young person being taken away at such an age, such a young age. He didn't have a chance to live his life. This is not extremely recent, but relatively recent. So some of the articles will still be available online and not archived onto newspaper sites. So there will be some links that I'll be able to put in this that will let you see some of the articles without having to go through that paywall of an archived news site or something like that. So with all that being said, let's get into today's episode. There are some things in life that we should never get used to hearing about, that we should never get to the point where it doesn't shock us anymore. But more and more every day, we're hearing about crimes and incidents to a point where some of us may feel like we've become immune. But today's case is definitely one of those that nobody should ever feel comfortable hearing about. This case involves the story of the death of a 13-year-old boy at the hand of his sister's boyfriend. His sister, who was 16 years old, and the boyfriend, who was 22 at the time. The 22-year-old boyfriend lived in the same home with his girlfriend's family. The 13-year-old, Brianna Collins, was still in middle school. His life had not truly begun at that point. But just knowing his age and knowing that he died, we'll know that he would never learn how to drive, to find the love of his life, or even get his heart broken for the first time, get married or have kids of his own. The boyfriend, in a rare case when it comes to crime these days, readily admitted and actually tried to get help for his girlfriend's brother. But what were the events that led to this? That led to one young man losing his life and another young man who, by most testimony given and the facts that fell behind the case, was a hardworking and some would say good man. What could have been done to prevent this situation? And would those measures have stopped any violence or just delayed them for a while? We'll never really know all of the true answers behind this, but to see anybody, especially a 13-year-old, listed on a National Gun Violence Memorial page is something that we should not see. It's something that should stop us in our tracks and try to reevaluate everything that is going on, not just to those in our locale or our community, but across the nation. Will this one case or any one case make a difference? Again, we'll probably not know all of the answers to those questions, but though this is just one case, when we look at the numbers of those killed, it is the case for those affected by Brianna Collins' death that they want to know the answers, but this is the case. This is the one that touched them completely, where they want and need to know the answers. Probably it's the first thing, or at least one of the first things, that those close to Brianna think about when they get up in the morning, and one of the last things that they think about at night. The worry that I thought would kind of go away once my children got older hasn't. If anything, it's only increased. So the thought of losing my child in such an unexpected and horrific manner is just unfathomable. To learn more, we need to go back to October of 2015. And initially, it seems hard to believe that 2015 was 9 years ago, almost a decade. But this is where we're going to start and go to Accomack County, Virginia, in the town of Painter. And I don't think we visited there before, so let's find out a little bit first about the area before we venture into Brianna's story. Now, as Painter is on the eastern shore, we can pretty much count that water is going to be very important to the town. But interestingly, while it's important, it's actually for the exact opposite reason than we're normally used to. The town itself is 36 feet above sea level. Comparatively, Denver lies at 5,280 feet, which is, while it's known as the Mile High City. But Painter is actually at a higher level than my hometown, which is 23 feet above sea level. Myself, when looking for a home, one of the major things that I looked at was how close it was to water and really how low it was as well, because there are some areas that are lower than others. And even with knowing that information and looking for specific factors, my street still floods quite frequently, especially during the summer months when we have some thunderstorms. So Painter is actually higher than many of the other areas on the eastern shore. The temperature also in Painter is pretty par for the course in the summer. July temperatures can get as high as 101, and the highest averaging temperatures are 95.6. If you look at the whole day, the average in July is around 87.6. So it gets a little cooler at night and first thing in the morning, but through most of the day, it's pretty high. So while many of those things are very characteristic of many other towns on the Eastern Shore, Painter itself was founded for being farther away from the shore. And though we do have many small towns on the Eastern Shore, Painter is definitely one of the smaller ones. The 2010 census officially said that there were 229 people, and the 2019 estimated number shows 224. Now, unlike many towns that were built directly near the water in the 17 or even 1600s, Painter did not become established until the introduction of the railroad. By the time that the railroad was beginning to transport goods, it was not really necessary to have towns built directly close to the water, and it also allowed new towns to be established, with Painter being one of those. It was not established until the 1880s, and one of the landmarks in the area was actually built, though, in 1784, and that was the Painter Garrison's United Methodist Church. The church was named after Jonathan Garrison, who hosted a Bishop Francis Asbury on a number of different occasions, at which point in 1787, those who had been meeting at Jonathan Garrison's home and worshiping decided to build a Methodist church in another nearby town called Mapsburg. Now, things do get a little complicated through later times. There was one church that was built, but a new building was built in 1906 in Painter, and it was somewhere in the mid to late 1920s when it was decided to actually bring the two buildings together. So the church was built in Painter, and then the original one that was built out of Garrison's hosting of Bishop Asbury were made into one. Now, by the way, I did know the name Francis Asbury from somewhere. It was one of those names that, kind of stuck in the back of my mind, like, I know that somewhere. And so I did actually look through some other articles or sites, and I believe where I first heard him was actually back in high school. And his name is famous not necessarily just on the Eastern Shore here, but as history during that time period was recorded, Francis Asbury was known to be a man born in England, but spent 45 years in the United States. But he was one of the first bishops of the Methodist Church, and especially in some of the smaller towns as we head towards other parts of Delmarva, I do see that there are a number of Methodist churches, and there are a big presence in a lot of communities. A friend of mine who lives in a more rural and very small community, he goes to a Methodist church, and at least as of about 10, 15 years ago, because we haven't spoken in a while, there would be a minister who had services at a number of different churches. So it was easier to have the minister travel from town to town, go to different churches, than to have a number of different parishioners all go to different areas. And especially during that time where automobiles were not a thing, that was something that was more convenient, useful, and just easier for people to get around and be able to congregate. Now, lastly, about Painter, even though the town itself has about the 224, give or take, numbers in the most recent census and afterwards, it's not even 3/4 of a square mile. So Painter is 0.65 square miles in area with no waterways directly in town. So that's where I'm saying it's a little bit different in regards to water, in that most of the towns were built up around ports, around rivers and lakes, things that would allow people to use the water to grow the community in terms of importing and exporting, or even just being able to sustain um, livelihood as far as fishing or doing even personal fishing to provide meals for your family at that time. It was only when trains became more prevalent and were able to carry goods across the land that Painter really sprung up into its own town. And just some speculation on my part, as far as trains go, it was probably much better to have it in a town like Painter, where even though 36 feet above sea level is not extremely high, it's much better than any of the towns that are at the coast or even have access to inland rivers, because I'm not directly on, the ocean or on the bay, but we are at a relatively low sea level, and most towns or most homes in my town, I've been told, don't have a basement. There might be a crawl space, but there are also sump pumps that are needed in order to keep the water out and flooding a home or causing other damage. But now we are back to October of 2015, and we're going to a home that is located on Keller Pond Road. On that day, a lot of anger was afoot and tempers were flared. Now, the 22-year-old boyfriend there was Nicholas White. And just to go back to emphasize some other things, he was living in his girlfriend's family's home, and she was 16 years old. I did not see her name reported anywhere in the articles, so I will refer to her mostly as the girlfriend or the sister, depending on which perspective I'm looking at it from, whether it's from Nicholas's or Brianna's. The incident did take place on a weekday, and I did come across some articles that said they were not sure why both teenagers were at home. It was a Friday, but I don't know, going back in time that far, if there may have been an in-service day, or given that it was in October, if there might have been a long weekend for Columbus Day, or in some areas it's called Discoverers Day. That may have been the case, as some schools will give a longer weekend and have that Friday off. But as it was not reported in some of the articles immediately, that seems like it was not the case. Otherwise, that should have been obvious then as to why both teenagers were at home. What we do find out is there was some information about Brianna's sister saying that she was actually suspended or expelled from school, according to some of the testimony provided. However, we don't know the reason for that suspension or expulsion, and that would still leave Brianna home, even though it was a school day. Now, on this day, the girlfriend slash sister had thought that Nicholas was receiving text messages from other women. An argument then ensued and continued to escalate. Nicholas's girlfriend thought about these messages, thought that he was cheating, and wanted to see the actual messages, but Nicholas did not show them to her. So at that point, the sister did start to hit and scratch Nicholas according to testimony provided. Also, some of the testimony provided does come directly from Nicholas, and I did not find any recorded testimony from the sister, so this is coming from Nicholas's perspective. In what is speculated to be an attempt to protect his sister, which, if this is the case, shows that he did have a big heart and loved her immensely, Brianna came into the room and he had a gun. Nicholas said he actually felt the gun against his side as Brianna approached him. He tried to turn Brianna around to go back towards the mother's room, but he still ended up, he meaning Brianna, he still ended up turning back, coming back to White, and pointing the gun at him. And this is where Nicholas did say he went in and got his own gun and told Brianna, again, according to Nicholas's testimony, that, quote, "Man, go ahead," end quote. The description we have from here is testimony that I'm sure we've all seen on TV shows, whether they be actual scripted shows or ones about mysteries and crimes. But Nicholas said that he had the gun, he had always kept it loaded, and he was in the hallway, quote, talking back and forth, end quote. And he said the gun just went off. So this was Nicholas's testimony, but I want to go back and kind of reanalyze it or go through it again, as just going through the quotes and the testimony he gave, I admit it can be a little confusing as to the exact sequence of events. So what had supposedly happened was Nicholas and his girlfriend were fighting. At some point during that fight, Nicholas stated that his girlfriend started to hit him, but as the tempers and the violence grew, Brianna came out of his mother's room and had a gun. At one point, Nicholas said he felt the gun on his side and tried to direct Brianna back to his mother's room. And Brianna had initially started to go back, but then stopped. At some point during this altercation as well, Nicholas had gotten his own gun, the gun that he admitted he always kept loaded. Though Brianna had been pointed back towards the direction of his mother's room, and with Nicholas, stating that he was saying, "Go ahead," during that sequence of events, Brianna then turned around again. So instead of heading back to his mother's room, he then turned around again to be facing Nicholas and the girlfriend/sister. The gun that Nicholas had was a sawed-off shotgun, and with Brianna turning back around towards him with the gun that Brianna had retrieved from the mother's room, it was ultimately Nicholas who fired the shot. The shot hit Brianna in the head, which nowhere is a good place to be shot, but it is ultimately one that many times is fatal as compared to, say, an arm or a foot, something like that. So the situation was very critical immediately. Though medical personnel, when they arrived at the scene, did everything they could to help Brianna, they knew that he needed to get to the hospital. From descriptions I've read, it does not sound like his condition was stable by any means, but they had to move him and try to get him to a medical facility. I did do a couple of searches for the closest hospital to Painter, Virginia, and I received a few different answers, with one even being the hospital in my hometown, which is at a minimum a couple of hours away. Another search said the closest hospital was 83 miles away. So no matter how you look at the situation, a hospital was not very close. And even if there was a hospital, it may not have been equipped to deal with such a catastrophic injury, even if he had made it to the hospital. But he did die en route. As information began to be gathered by investigators and statements were taken, Nicholas White said that his girlfriend, Brianna's sister, had actually stabbed him that day as well, but the description as to where he may have been stabbed and what he was stabbed with was not provided in any of the articles, at least that I was able to locate. However, it did sound, based on testimony, like there was always a lot of tension or tempers running high in that household. Additionally, to give kind of a time frame or context to the situation, Nicholas had been living with his girlfriend and her family for about 4 months at that point, and they had been dating each other for around 8 months. When Nicholas didn't have a place to stay, Brianna's mother said that he could stay there. I did, as well as other people at the time, try to find out if any charges had been brought against Nicholas because at 22, he was an adult and Brianna, 16, was a minor. So I did look at the age of consent in the state of Virginia, and that would be 18. Now, in what I've noticed just throughout the years, it seems usually that 17 is the age in some states and 18 is in others. Growing up, I believe there were more states where it was 16 years old, but that seems to have been kind of phased out for the most part to where it's either 17 or 18. But regardless, this was not really mentioned at any place in most of the articles or in the case breakdown during the sentencing. Now, like I said, Nicholas did readily admit to what had happened. He also reportedly ran to another home of a neighbor that he knew was a nurse, and he, wanted to get her attention and bring her over to try to get help for Brianna. The initial charges brought against Nicholas White were for murder, but it was reduced to manslaughter, and Nicholas received 10 years. So there's some things to unpack here. First, was this truly manslaughter and not self-defense? Given testimony that there had been tempers flying that day and that Brianna was in fact the person who brought out the first gun, this is something that the prosecutors probably had to think about really hard in terms of what to charge Nicholas White with. It could have also been argued that, as again, Brianna was the one who brought the gun out first, that Nicholas was just defending himself. But again, this was a 13-year-old boy. And though Nicholas did have time to go and get his own gun, could this have been a case where Nicholas White could have been more mature and talked to Brianna in a calm manner instead of resorting to going to get his own gun? It's easy for some of us to think that way, given that the actual mental age between 13 and 22 is massive, that at 22, Nicholas White may have or should have a more calm approach to the situation, but he did go, in fact, and get his own gun. When the judge in the case, a Judge W. Revel Lewis III, was summing things up, he shared how Nicholas White had lost his parents at a very young age, and that he worked multiple jobs and had never been in trouble at all. But in a matter of probably 5 minutes or less, lives were changed and one ended. Brianna lost his life before he had even started to live it. He was still observing and learning things that he would need to do and how to live if he had actually gotten that chance to become an adult. His sister witnessed all of this happening, and that will stay with her for the rest of her life. Nicholas White, who had worked so hard to fight against everything that had gone against him, the adversity of losing his parents, and working to try to just survive, and eventually, though not graduating with the rest of his class, actually going back, getting his diploma, and was reasonably well adjusted given those situations. Everything was lost in just the pull of a trigger, and he's still losing 10 years of his life in prison. He will have difficulty finding gainful employment once he's released, and every day he will think about those moments in time, the short moments that took away a life and changed so many others. As I'm looking at the time frame and knowing that we're really almost to 10 years, I wonder if Nicholas White has been released. Going into some more personal observations, as any of the more, I guess you would say, more subjective observances were made by others, whether it be the judge or somebody writing an article. But now I'm looking back at it as myself, as a mother, and just as someone who hates violence in any sense, much less violence where a person loses their life, and this one being a child. Now, when I'm looking at this case, the first thing that struck me as it was, being narrated through the newspapers or through other articles was that Nicholas was 22 and the girlfriend was 16. Now, depending on exactly when their birthdays are, it's not outside of the realm of possibility that the girlfriend was only 15 or just had turned 16 when they started dating. At the time of these events, it had been approximately 8 months since they had started dating, and she was 16. So, at the time of the events. So, no matter what, it would put her, possibly at 15 years old or pretty early in, to being 16. And Nicholas White could have been 21 to 22 when they started dating. So this in and of itself is not, it's not right at all. It's illegal no matter how you look at it. So the 10 years that he's spending in prison, none of that addresses the first thing that led to this situation. And that was that Nicholas was living in the home of his minor girlfriend and her family. So that was never addressed in terms of charges being brought or a sentence being passed down because of that. And that's where I really took a step back and where I said this had to be one of the cases where I tried to be as impartial as possible because kind of instinctively, I want to add more time to the case. Now, without knowing that information, let's just say the girlfriend had been 22 and Nicholas was 22, but they were living in the home with the younger brother and the rest of the girlfriend's family. I, I would have never thought of that. It would have been, okay, I would have looked at the case and asked, did the boyfriend really feel threatened by a 13-year-old with a gun? Did he make any conversation or try to remain calm to try to make sure that Brianna was, calm enough as well after all of the tempers had flared and the argument going on, knowing that Brianna would put down the gun and they could step away and try to have a conversation or just even walk away from everything and let everybody's feelings kind of level out before they tried to talk again. We would have to look at it and know that Nicholas White was the one who had to be the adult and lead in that situation. But as it was, there were a lot of tempers flying. There was a 13-year-old with a gun. There was a girlfriend and sister who was probably extremely upset, who had been, per Nicholas White, in the midst of an altercation with him just before Brianna came out with the gun. So everybody's emotions had to be running very high. And though Nicholas did try to direct Brianna back to the bedroom, by testimony provided, Brianna turned back around. So looking at that, if I did not know that the sister was 16, I would have to really ask, did Nicholas White feel like his life was in danger? And is that what happened in this case? And if I'm just looking at Brianna and Nicholas without the sister being in there, I would really have a struggle if I was on a jury deciding what the best option would be, whether it would be self-defense, whether it would be manslaughter. He did have a gun, so there were multiple guns in the home, one that Brianna could get and one that Nicholas got. So one of the questions would be, was Nicholas legally allowed to own a gun? and I did not find that information. So if he was not prohibited from owning a gun, that would be a factor too if a jury had actually had to make this decision. Even though Brianna was 13, if someone came with a gun at that age, that's still a weapon that can be used to hurt someone. So, what I feel is that there are a lot of questions that don't have answers. And all of it led to a 13-year-old who felt that he needed to protect his sister from a man who was much older than her. He had access to a gun and he got that to try to protect his sister. That situation would not have come about if Nicholas had not been living in the home. We need to know answers on why exactly were they home from school. Now, if the sister was suspended or expelled, was it something about a fight? Anything like that that may have shown violence on her part? And additionally, why was Brianna home if it was not an in-service day or a day off school? And again, given that some of the articles were written just around the time of the events, it feels like that would have been stated somewhere. But what was actually stated were questions about why they may have been home on a school day. So, given all of these circumstances, I couldn't help but wonder if Nicholas White was jailed or imprisoned, not necessarily because he shot Brianna, but because of the situation all around. The fact that if he had not been living in the home, that most likely a situation like this would have never arisen. Looking at the fact that he had a relationship with a 16-year-old, was she emotionally mature enough or even emotionally near the same level as Nicholas that a long-term relationship with an older person would have even been viable? Should they have had any interaction at all? It does seem, based on speculation, which is why I say it seems, that the suspension or expulsion was because of a violent incident, fighting. So her emotional maturity may not have been, as matured as Nicholas's. Now, I don't mean to be putting any blame back on anybody else in the family, because ultimately it was Nicholas and Brianna who had the gun. Nicholas, who was 22, an adult, compared to a 13-year-old, who, when he said that he pointed Brianna into the direction of his mother's room, what other steps could he have taken to make sure that Brianna felt safe, that Brianna felt like his sister wasn't in danger anymore, that Nicholas was the adult who should have shown more maturity in trying to handle the situation. But instead, at one point, he kind of goaded Brianna on, that, he had said, go ahead, so that even if he did turn Brianna back towards his mother's room to put the gun back, there was no follow-up. It seems like nobody there was emotionally mature enough. Brianna and the sister, of course, were still kids themselves. And, based on your perspective, 22 years old is still a kid. I feel like 22-year-old is a kid now, even looking back to when I was 22 years old. So was anybody really mature enough in that situation that they should have had access to guns in the first place? You're living in a home where there are minors. Just without all of the information, as again, that this story didn't seem to get a lot of press or, have a lot of information out there, given, the circumstances that it was a child who was killed, that Nicholas seemed to be a very hardworking young man. So he, I did question earlier whether or not Nicholas could have had a gun. That's just something that I think we always have to question in terms of background. But there was no other criminal case that would make us think that, he shouldn't have had a gun, except we'd have to look at his emotional maturity and figure out if he should have had one. As to a shotgun or another firearm being readily accessible to anybody in the home, where, Brianna did go and get a gun which through the articles said it was in the mother's room, that it was easily accessible for anybody in that house. So whether it had been Brianna, the girlfriend, or even Nicholas, if he didn't have his own gun, could have gotten to that firearm and, in a fit of anger, done anything. So there's a lot of questions there that I think weren't fully answered. It was almost like, okay, we have someone who's accepting responsibility, who, you know, is saying, yes, I did it. And so let's just go ahead and get the sentencing done with, and that's that, without really exploring all of the other issues that came around it. So was the 10 years truly for killing Brianna? Was it a combination of killing Brianna and the fact that he was 22-year-old dating a minor? Or did some people really look at it more as the latter charge, that he was 22 years old, living with a minor and her family? It's very hard to separate those because without one, there would not have been the other. Without Nicholas living in the home, there most likely would not have been the shooting, because even if Nicholas was having a fight with his girlfriend, odds are Brianna wouldn't have been there. Plus, it would have probably been in a home they had together where the mother's gun would not have been available either. So all of those are just kind of left unanswered. And I'm looking back at it thinking if just one thing was different, this 13-year-old would still have his life. He could be going to college or just finishing college. He could be starting a career. He could be working in a career that he loves. It just will never happen because of all of these things coming together and costing the life of a 13-year-old. So I hope I did well enough in kind of separating things like the emotions that I know I instinctively felt when I read this, and trying to be impartial in telling the story up until, I said I'm being, more of my own feelings about the story. I just think it's something that really emphasizes things in society. And one, that it's never usually one thing that leads to an incident like this. But also, two, we don't always have all of the information. There's so many things that I still have questions about. And how are we ever going to really be able to try to prevent incidents like this happening if they're not truly explored? If it's just kind of left at, well, he confessed, we're all set, here's the charge. Or do we want to look at all the steps that led to this? For example, the judge mentioned that his family had died at a young age, his parents, and he pretty much had to work himself through, the rest of schooling. He didn't have anybody really that he could turn to. So what if there was a better system in place that even if, let's just say, he was 18 or 19 when his parents died, that's still very young. It doesn't say the exact age that they died. So we don't know if he was a minor, in which case, was he with family? Was he a ward of the state? What happened there? Or at 19, 20 years old, that's still very young not to have a family around you to support you. So what services could there have been to try to support him? Because it's not only Nicholas White who is young and doesn't have that support. There are many people in the foster system that once they turn 18, they won't have anybody there to support them, and what needs to be done to help support them in general. So there just really wasn't a lot of information or research done to see what we as a society can do to try to address these concerns before they result in something like this. So again, I am not trying to place blame on anybody else within Nicholas's family or Brianna's family, but I'm just trying to bring about questions that will help us better understand this incident and any incident close to this so that we can try to prevent them. The old saying, which I'm probably paraphrasing to an extent, is those who never learn from history are doomed to repeat it. So unless we learn from incidents like this, Shortly thereafter, there'll be another one. It may not be the exact same circumstances, but they'll be close enough that it might leave someone saying, we should have done something more, we knew better. But that doesn't seem to be happening. So, everybody, thank you for kind of hanging in there with me. Again, I know it's been a little while. I've said that in previous episodes. I'm trying to get organized for the new school year. It almost feels like we didn't have a summer because there was so much going on, and that the summer just flew by, but not because, we were doing a lot of things that we enjoyed. It was just a tough summer. So, I'm trying to, like I said, become more organized, have things scheduled and more in place, even though on the first day of school I'm already really kind of off that schedule. So I'll have to see, what the next few weeks hold, and hopefully I will get back to normal. But thanks again, everyone. I will be back to you soon with another episode, and have a great one.